When you start a YouTube channel about movies, they make you sign a series of complicated documents requiring you to talk about horror films in the month of October. So, for this year's legal obligation, we're taking a world tour of some of our favorite spooky subgenres. And our first trip around the globe is going to suck. What we've come to know about vampires as a fiction genre has of course evolved over the years, but there's really only one place to start when it comes to vampire movies: Transylvania, and Bram Stoker's turn-of-the-century gothic horror tale, Dracula. There's some debate about where Stoker's inspiration for Dracula came from. The smart money is on tales of Vlad the Impaler's reputation for cruel battlefield tactics, but it's also just as likely Dracula is based on the monstrous horror stories of the famine years in Ireland that Stoker grew up hearing. The point is, while vampires are decidedly not real, the inspiration for their stories can be, which makes this branch of the undead very flexible. Filmmakers from around the world have taken the formula laid out in Stoker's novel and reshaped it to suit their own themes, and for us, the 5 most important parts of the Dracula equation are as follows. Number 1, and most obvious, vampires drink blood. Number 2, they're immortal and super difficult to kill. Number 3, vampires are intrinsically tied to religion. Number 4, vampire mythology is most effective when rooted in an artist's experience. And number 5, which is just as obvious as number 1, they're usually pretty sexy. So, how have vampire films from around the world taken advantage of this formula? Let's start with the gory stuff. To restate the obvious, blood is literally what keeps vampires going. So any vampire movie is going to need a lot of it. Some films spill the blood with action, like Blade and Robert Rodriguez's From Dusk Till Dawn, or Timur Bekmambetov's Night Watch out of Russia, or Catherine Bigelow's brooding vampire western Near Dark. Other films that are just as violent, although less action-oriented, bring the blood by the bucketful as well, and for this, we're looking to Sweden and 2008's Let the Right One In. When a quiet, bullied Oscar meets his new neighbor, he not only discovers a kindred spirit, but slowly realizes Ellie is something more than meets the eye. Even Ellie not being formally invited into Oscar's home ends covered in blood. The blood and the violence throughout the film is ultimately a result of loneliness. The rage felt by Oscar and the isolation felt by Ellie are the true catalysts of the story. And a lonely vampire is one of our favorite byproducts of Vampire Equation Part 2, immortality. If there's an upside to being a vampire, it's the whole not dying thing. There is, of course, the very compelling argument that immortality is just another downside of being a bloodsucker. This is the spot for films like Neil Jordan's gorgeous 1994 Interview with the Vampire and his equally moody Byzantium. Coppola's sweeping gothic Bram Stoker's Dracula, Guillermo del Toro's first feature from Mexico, Cronos, where the pursuit of immortality drives the plot, the themes, and the main character's thirst for blood. The most recent Dracula to come out of the UK and onto Netflix added a new layer to the battle, but for our favorite example of the downside of immortality, we're going to the lonely streets of Iran to a place called Bad Town, and a girl walks home alone at night. In Ana Lily Amirpour's Persian-language feature-length debut, the titular vampire trolling the lonely city's deserted streets is just one of several characters feeding off the town in what plays as a dreamlike, endless Sisyphean loop from which there is no escape. The film starts from a place of danger and loneliness and lets that feeling permeate through everything else. The end result is a David Lynch-like mix of just about everything, from spaghetti western influences to rockabilly to the idea of escaping dire circumstances. The film is a prime example of vampire mythology being mapped onto anything relevant to a filmmaker's own experience, which brings us to point number 3. Vampires have always been used to explore folklore from around the globe, including, as we mentioned, Bram Stoker's Dracula. In the 70s, Bill Gunn's avant-garde horror classic Ganja and Hess is a mashup of vampire mythology and Afrocentric folklore. And Werner Herzog's remake of the silent film classic Nosferatu is an indictment of the ruling class's dismissal of the old tales vampires are based on in the first place. But it works on a smaller, more personal scale as well. Joel Schumacher's 80s punk take on vampires, The Lost Boys, uses the monsters to show how hard it is for a kid to move to a new town and come into your own, a rite of passage every culture mythologizes. And Netflix's recent Vampires vs. the Bronx takes on the gentrification of a beloved neighborhood in a way not unlike Herzog and Murnau before him. But some of the wildest and honestly most fun folklore-based vampire movies exploded out of Hong Kong in the 80s, with Mr. Vampire leading the way. Known as hopping vampires, Jiangshi are corpses brought back to life by Taoist magic according to Chinese legend. In the 80s, thanks to directors like Ricky Lau and Sammo Hung, these hopping vampires were reanimated and thrust into some amazing martial arts films, blending comedy, camp, and kung fu with a legend dating back to at least the 17th century. Mr. Vampire is, quite frankly, a blast. It shares some commonalities with Western vampire fiction as well, most notably that the heroic Master Cao, priest of the Taoist supernatural arts, uses his knowledge to not only kick stylized vampire butt, but brings religious artifacts to bear as weapons against the Jiangshi, continuing a central conflict for the creatures of the night: vampires versus religion. The cross and holy water have been weapons used in the fight against vampires on screen from the very beginning, from Bela Lugosi's first appearance in Universal's Dracula to Christopher Lee's run in the UK-based Hammer Films Dracula movies. But we also can't talk about global cinema in the 21st century without taking a trip to South Korea, this time to take a look at Park Chan-wook's Thirst.
이 병자를 재해서 해방시키시고 구원해 주시며 자비로이 그 병고를 가볍게 해 주소서. 아멘.
Thirst is the story of a priest leading a devout but mundane life until he unwittingly becomes a vampire thanks to a blood transfusion. His faith led him to volunteer for the experiment, his faith racks him with guilt as he comes to terms with his transformation, and in spite of everything he does along the way, and this movie goes to some strange places in its 2.5-hour runtime, he still believes in the end. Park Chan-wook's entire skill set is on display as the film manages to be shocking, darkly hilarious, and of course, our fifth favorite pillar of vampires on film, pretty damn sexy. If you'll allow me a dad joke, you might say Count Dracula was the original thirst trap. The charm and charisma of the vampire is maybe the most consistent thing through the years. The vampire's very essence is that of a penetrating, fluid-draining monster. It's a psychosexual projection going all the way back to the start. Even when the vampire is portrayed as a gross-looking monster in Nosferatu, there is a love story buried in the film's heart. Christopher Lee's run in the UK starting in the late 50s leaned hard into the sensual nature of Dracula and played the character with a sexually charged presence into the 70s. That decade also gave way to a much more overtly erotic brand of vampire. Sapphic vampire films like the Karnstein trilogy, also out of the UK, featured lesbian vampires based on the novel Carmilla, which actually predated Bram Stoker's Dracula by a few decades. Spain's The Blood-Spattered Bride was loosely based on that book as well. While films like the pre-code Dracula's Daughter and France's Blood and Roses predate the 70s explosion of this particular subgenre, for the most art house example, we'll stay in the 70s and in Europe with Daughters of Darkness.
Let the dead bury the dead.
It's difficult to forget.
Ah, you will. After a while, it'll only be the remembrance of a bad dream, and then the remains of a remembrance, more and more faint in your mind. I have seen many a night fall away into an even more endless night.
Nights like last night.
An English-language Belgian film, Daughters of Darkness plays like a slow-burn nightmare for much of its runtime. A young newlywed couple crosses paths with a mysterious Hungarian countess, but the film is as much a precursor to erotic thrillers like Fatal Attraction or Basic Instinct as it is more recent vampire films. Delphine Seyreg's countess seductively manipulates every scene, every line she delivers to stage a battle of wills, draining the love and empathy from her victims instead of violently relieving them of their blood. More abstract than other overtly sexual takes on vampires, Daughters of Darkness goes gothically decadent and never looks back. But like any good subgenre, there's room for variables in the equation, space to maneuver and make something that truly fits the Bram Stoker formula, but also becomes something else entirely. This is a subversive lot that includes Canada's own David Cronenberg and his body horror armpit vampire from Rabid, or the revisionist making-of film Shadow of the Vampire. It's Tobe Hooper's space vampires from Life Force and whatever Abraham Lincoln Vampire Hunter was. But mostly, this is a spot for what we do in the shadows.
I'm guessing I've come to the end of the road.
It was you the whole time. Prepare for your punishment, Cravensworth. It will not be swift.
Not without a fight, me old fruit.
Oh my god, they're vampires!
Taking nearly every trope there is, certainly every one we've discussed here, the New Zealand-born What We Do in the Shadows makes fun of them all. Violent and oblivious, self-obsessed and sex-obsessed, the immortal vampires in both the film and TV versions take their boredom seriously, but to hilarious effect. It's the perfect marriage of Interview with the Vampire's breadth of character and This Is Spinal Tap's mockumentary idiocy. Maybe the most extreme example of how nimble this vampire genre can be. What We Do in the Shadows clearly understands and appreciates over a century's worth of vampire lore and lovingly destroys it all, which is why every vampire on all of What We Do in the Shadows are some of our favorites of all time. What do you think about vampires? Let us know what your favorite ones are from around the world. Which ones did we miss? And as always, subscribe to CineFix for more horrifying trips around the world all month long.